Today General Hospital will reveal Drew Cain's life was irrevocably altered the moment two bullets tore through his back, shattering not only his body but the very foundation of the man he had always been. The injury to his spine was devastating, stripping him of the simple yet profound freedom of movement that most take for granted. When he opened his eyes in the hospital and felt the absence of sensation in his lower body, he was thrust into a cruel new reality. The doctors spoke in cautious tones, avoiding promises they could not keep, reminding him that the damage was perilously close to his spinal cord. There was a possibility of partial recovery, but there was no certainty, and the grim possibility remained that Drew might never walk again. That knowledge was like a chain tightening around his spirit, and as he sat confined to a wheelchair, he was forced to confront not only his physical limitations but the crushing weight of what his future might become. The physical agony was relentless, but it was the emotional torment that gnawed deepest. Drew had always been a man of action, a soldier, a leader, someone who thrived on his ability to protect and provide. Now, he stared at a life defined by immobility, and it tore at his sense of identity. He oscillated between desperate hope and paralyzing fear, hope that some miracle of medicine might restore him, and fear that he was destined to spend the rest of his life chained to a chair. In those quiet moments between therapy sessions, when the pain dulled just enough for his mind to wander, Drew found himself questioning not only his body's strength but his very purpose. Would he still matter to those he loved if he was no longer the man he once was? Would people see him as weak, as a burden? Those thoughts haunted him more than the shooting itself. It was Willow who became the anchor in the storm, refusing to let Drew sink into despair. She saw what others could not, saw that the walls of General Hospital in Port Charles were closing in on him, suffocating him with limitations and bureaucracy. The whispers of staff, the pity in their eyes, the lack of advanced resource, all of it combined to convince her that this was no place for Drew to reclaim his life. With quiet determination, Willow made the decision that no one else dared to consider. She arranged for Drew to be transferred to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, one of the few places in the country where experimental treatments and cutting-edge rehabilitation offered even a sliver of hope. Her choice was met with resistance. Family members and friends questioned her judgment, fearful that moving Drew so far away would sever him from the support system he needed most. Some accused her of being reckless, of gambling with Drew's fragile state for the faint promise of recovery. Yet Willow stood firm. She knew the risks, but she also knew that staying in Port Charles meant condemning Drew to stagnation, to an existence defined by what he could no longer do. Boston, with its world-class specialists and innovative therapies, represented possibility. Even if that possibility was slim, it was better than the certainty of decline. Willow's resolve came not from blind optimism but from an unshakable sense of loyalty. She understood that Drew's fight was not only for his body but for his dignity, for his identity as a man who had once stood tall against impossible odds. She was willing to shoulder the burden of criticism, to absorb the tension within the family, and even to put her own happiness aside if it meant giving Drew a chance at reclaiming himself. The decision to move him was not simply medical, it was an act of love, of defiance against a fate that sought to break him. For Drew, the transfer to Boston was both a physical relocation and a symbolic exile. Leaving Port Charles meant leaving behind his home, his family, and the daily rhythms of the life he had built. It felt like being stripped of everything familiar at the very moment he was most vulnerable. Yet, beneath the sorrow and frustration, there flickered a small flame of determination. Perhaps Boston would not only test the limits of medicine but also test his resilience, forcing him to redefine what strength truly meant. The wheelchair that once felt like a prison slowly began to transform into a symbol of survival. It was not where Drew wanted to be, but it was proof that he was still alive, still fighting. With Willow at his side, refusing to let him surrender, he began to see that his journey was not over, it was simply taking a path he had never expected. What lay ahead in Boston was uncertain, but uncertainty itself was better than the hopeless finality he had feared in Port Charles. And in that fragile uncertainty, Drew found the faintest spark of hope, the kind of hope that could one day carry him back home not as a broken man, but as someone remade through fire and perseverance. Drew Cain's departure from Port Charles was cloaked in the weight of medical necessity, but the truth beneath it was far more insidious. What unfolded was not simply the tragic aftermath of a violent attack, but the calculated orchestration of a woman who understood how to manipulate both medicine and perception to her advantage. Portia Robinson, standing on the foundation of her authority as a physician, quietly bent the truth to suit her purpose. She tampered with Drew's medical files, subtle alterations in test results, and clinical notes that, on the surface, looked like ordinary documentation but in reality painted a distorted picture of his spinal condition. Where his injuries left room for hope within the resources of General Hospital, the altered records suggested catastrophic instability, the kind of crisis that demanded immediate transfer to a more advanced facility. With a few strokes of her hand, Portia transformed Drew from a patient with options into a liability that needed to be sent away at once. The efficiency of her plan was chilling. There was no overt confrontation, no public spectacle, only a quiet string of decisions that pushed Drew out of Port Charles under the guise of urgent necessity. To the outside world, it looked as though the hospital had acted responsibly, giving him the best possible chance by sending him to Boston. Few questioned the move. After all, who would dare challenge the recommendation of a doctor sworn to preserve life? Portia played her role with practiced ease, and in doing so, she secured more than just Drew's removal, cleared space in Port Charles for her influence to spread unopposed. Among the townspeople, the news of Drew's departure carried an undercurrent of satisfaction that was difficult to ignore. Over the years, Drew had made enemies as much as allies, his decisions in business, his entanglements in family disputes, and his involvement in law enforcement matters placing him at odds with many of Port Charles' most powerful players. To those who resented his presence, watching him leave broken and bound to a wheelchair felt like vindication. It was not openly celebrated. Port Charles was a place where decorum still mattered, but in hushed conversations and concealed smirks, there was a sense of relief, as if an irritant had finally been removed. The man who once commanded strength and authority was now exiled in weakness, and for some, that was a victory sweeter than any public triumph. But while Portia's plan seemed flawless on the surface, it overlooked one essential truth. Drew Kane was not a man who easily accepted defeat. The shock of his exile was compounded by the slow realization that his departure was not just the result of medical misfortune but of deliberate manipulation. At first, he tried to suppress the thought, convincing himself that perhaps his mind was only searching for someone to blame. Yet the inconsistencies gnawed at him. Why had the urgency of his transfer been so abrupt? Why had the doctors at GH seemed reluctant to answer his questions directly? And why, in Boston, did some of the specialists express confusion over the notes they received from Port Charles? The more Drew pieced together these fragments, the clearer the picture became. Someone had engineered his removal. That knowledge cut deeper than the bullets ever had. His paralysis was a wound of the body, but the betrayal was a wound of the soul. To be struck down in violence was one thing, to be cast aside by those who were meant to heal him was another. The bitterness took hold quickly. Every time he sat in the wheelchair, every time he struggled through grueling therapy, he felt not only the pain of his broken body but also the sting of having been discarded like a burden. Portia's deception had stripped him of more than mobility, it had robbed him of his place in the community he had fought to be part of. Boston became both his prison and his crucible. In the sterile halls of Massachusetts General Hospital, Drew began the slow, punishing work of rehabilitation. The exercises were excruciating, the hours long, and the progress so incremental that despair was a constant companion. Yet beneath the surface of that suffering, something else stirred. Drew's spirit hardened, sharpened by anger and the need for justice. He was no longer content to merely fight for his legs, he would fight for his truth. He began by asking questions, quietly at first, probing the doctors who now oversaw his care. He learned that some of the data in his Port Charles files did not align with the imaging and test results conducted in Boston. The discrepancies were small but telling. A measurement off here, a description exaggerated there. To an untrained eye, they might have passed unnoticed. To Drew, they were proof. He requested copies of everything, both from Port Charles and Boston, and compared them late into the night when the hospital halls were silent. Each contradiction added fuel to the fire of his resolve. What emerged from this investigation was a revelation as devastating as it was empowering. Portia had manipulated the evidence to ensure his removal. It was not incompetence. It was not a mistake. It was a calculated act designed to rid Port Charles of him. Drew was no longer just a victim of an anonymous gunman, was the casualty of an orchestrated betrayal from within. This realization shifted something profound within him. The wheelchair that had once symbolized defeat now became a reminder of the war he had been thrust into. He began to view every therapy session not as a step toward recovery alone but as preparation for the battle to come. His time in Boston was no longer exile, it was training, rebuilding not only his body but his resolve. He masked his progress, concealing the small but significant signs of improvement, knowing that surprise would be his greatest weapon when the time came to return. Meanwhile, in Port Charles, the narrative of his departure solidified. To many, Drew was gone, a broken man unlikely to ever reclaim his place. For his enemies, this was the end of his influence. For Portia, it was a quiet triumph. Yet none of them could see the storm gathering in Boston. None of them could imagine that the man they believed sidelined forever was quietly gathering strength, collecting evidence, and planning a return that would shake the foundations of everything they thought secure. Drew Cain had been shot, paralyzed, and betrayed, but he was not finished. The bitterness that had once threatened to consume him had transformed into clarity. He understood now that his life had been reduced to a pawn in someone else's game, and the only way forward was to seize control of the board. His exile would not be his end, it would be the beginning of something far more dangerous. When he returned to Port Charles, he would not come as a victim but as a man reborn in fire, armed with truth, and ready to expose the betrayal that had sought to destroy him. Drew's transfer to Boston marked not just a change in geography but the beginning of an entirely new chapter defined by uncertainty, exhaustion, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. At Massachusetts General, the routines were unrelenting. He was thrust into a punishing schedule that combined aggressive physical therapy with experimental procedures designed to push the limits of modern medicine. The exercises were merciless, hours spent strapped to machines that forced movement into his paralyzed legs, endless repetitions of tasks that left him trembling with fatigue, and sessions where doctors tested neural stimulation devices in the hope of coaxing dormant pathways back to life. Each day felt like a battlefield of its own, but unlike the wars he had fought before, this one was waged against his own body and the despair that threatened to crush him. Willow was his constant presence, hovering at his side with patience that belied the turmoil raging inside her. She encouraged him when he faltered, steadied him when the pain grew too sharp, and refused to let him surrender when he begged for rest. Yet beneath her calm surface, she carried a terrible secret. She knew Portia had orchestrated his exile, and each time she looked into Drew's eyes, she felt the sting of guilt. She longed to confess, to unburden herself of the truth, but she feared what it would do to him. Drew's fury was already simmering beneath the surface, and revealing Portia's role could ignite it into a blaze that might consume him before he was strong enough to wield it. So Willow carried the weight alone, a silent burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Drew himself could not shake the shadow of betrayal. It clung to him in every therapy session, in every sterile hospital corridor, in every sleepless night where he stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment his life had been stolen. Each small improvement, a flicker of sensation in his legs, a faint muscle twitch, was tempered by the reminder that he should never have been in Boston in the first place. Progress became a double-edged sword, feeding both his hope of recovery and his rage at those who had exiled him. With every strained breath and every bead of sweat on his brow, he vowed silently that he would not let his story end this way. Meanwhile, back in Port Charles, his absence created ripples of its own. Some watched his departure with smug satisfaction, confident that they no longer had to contend with his influence. To them, Drew's exile was a relief, the removal of a thorn in their side. But others, more astute and more cautious, viewed his absence with unease. They knew Drew's history, his resilience, his refusal to yield in the face of impossible odds. They whispered that a man like Drew would not simply fade away, that even chained to a wheelchair he remained a formidable threat. They feared that if he discovered the truth about Portia's deception, or worse, if he somehow recovered enough strength to stand again, his return would be nothing short of catastrophic. In Boston, Drew began to embody that very possibility. The doctors pushed him to his breaking point, and though his progress was painstakingly slow, there were glimpses of something more. Nerves flickered with faint signals, his muscles responded to electrical stimulation, and moments came when he swore he could almost feel the floor beneath his feet again. Each of these milestones was a spark that reignited his determination. To the medical team, they were signs of potential recovery. To Drew, they were promises of a future where he would no longer be bound by steel and wheels. But more than that, every sign of progress fed his deeper, darker drive, the need to return to Port Charles and confront those who had betrayed him. He began to imagine that return in vivid detail, shock on their faces, the fear in their eyes when the man they had written off as broken reappeared stronger than ever. The thought sustained him through the grueling therapy sessions, transforming pain into fuel and despair into discipline. His journey in Boston became more than rehabilitation. It became preparation, both physical and psychological, for a reckoning that he knew was inevitable. Those in Port Charles who had smiled at his departure had underestimated him. They believed the bullets and the wheelchair had broken him, but they had only forged him into something harder, sharper, and more dangerous. The whispers of his resilience began to spread, stories of his determination leaking back from Boston through nurses, visiting doctors, and the occasional family member who caught glimpses of his relentless fight. These whispers stoked fear in those who had conspired against him, for they knew that if Drew Cain returned, he would not come back quietly. He would come back as a storm, and storms did not discriminate between the guilty and the complicit. Thus, the journey in Boston was not merely about healing. It was about transformation. Each painful session, each experimental surgery, each sleepless night pushed Drew closer to the man he needed to become to reclaim his life. And with Willow at his side, both a comfort and a secret keeper, the stage was being set for a return that would shake Port Charles to its core. The town may have believed that Drew was gone, broken, and finished, but in truth, Boston was forging him anew on when he came back. He would bring with him not only the scars of betrayal but the fury of a man reborn in fire and pain. Drew Cain had been cast out of Port Charles in a manner that seemed, on the surface, like the tragic but inevitable consequence of a violent attack. Two bullets had reduced him to a man in a wheelchair, and Portia Robinson's quiet manipulations had turned his injury into an excuse for exile. To most of the town, his departure was the end of a story, the quiet removal of a figure who had long disrupted fragile balances of power. But what no one realized was that exile was not the end, it was the crucible. Boston was not merely a place of rehabilitation, it was the forge where Drew was stripped down to nothing, only to be rebuilt stronger, harder, and more dangerous than ever before. The treatments he endured at Massachusetts General were brutal, more demanding than anything he had ever faced in his years as a soldier. His days began before dawn, with experimental neural stimulation therapies designed to awaken dormant pathways in his damaged spinal cord. Electrodes sent shocks of current through his legs, forcing spasms of movement that left him drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion. Afternoons were consumed with sessions in exoskeleton frames, robotic braces that locked onto his body and dragged his unresponsive limbs through the motions of walking. The devices were mechanical, cold, and relentless, but they gave him a glimpse of what might be possible if he refused to surrender. Nights were no respite either. He spent them in pain management programs and counseling sessions meant to address the psychological toll of paralysis. Though Drew quickly realized that the psychologists could not begin to fathom the depth of betrayal that drove him forward. Through it all, Willow was at his side. She steadied him when his body faltered, whispered encouragement when he wanted to give up, and absorbed the jagged edges of his anger when frustration boiled over. But beneath her devotion lay a secret that weighed heavily on her conscience. She knew that Drew's exile was not a natural outcome but the result of Portia's calculated interference. Every time she looked into Drew's eyes and saw the flicker of suspicion there, she feared he might unravel the truth before he was ready to face it. So she bore the knowledge in silence, torn between protecting him and betraying him further by hiding what she knew. That silent burden aged her quickly, but she refused to abandon him, determined to help him survive even if it meant carrying the unbearable weight of deception. For Drew, suspicion was a constant companion. He could not shake the feeling that his removal from Port Charles had been engineered, and as the weeks in Boston stretched on, the inconsistencies in his medical files became impossible to ignore. The doctors in Boston often raised questions that unsettled him. Why had certain scans been interpreted so pessimistically? Why had his case been rushed for transfer when General Hospital could have continued his treatment? These questions gnawed at him until doubt hardened into certainty. Someone had tampered with his records. He did not yet know the extent of Portia's betrayal, but he knew enough to understand that he had been forced out. And that realization transformed his rehabilitation from a medical journey into a mission of preparation. Drew began to adapt the way he had once adapted on battlefields. He learned to mask his progress, deliberately downplaying small victories so that no one outside his immediate circle would know how far he was truly coming. When his legs responded faintly to electrical stimulation, he feigned disappointment. When the exoskeleton training sessions became easier, he grimaced and pretended otherwise. To the medical staff, he was a man clawing desperately at the faintest hope, his recovery minimal at best. In truth, he was making strides faster than anyone realized, and he intended to keep it that way until the moment came to reveal his strength on his own terms. Beyond the walls of the hospital, Drew quietly cultivated alliances. There were doctors sympathetic to his plight, nurses who confided in him about the discrepancies they noticed between his Port Charles records and the data being collected in Boston, and even a handful of veterans in the Boston community who recognized and drew the determination of a man who had been wronged. These alliances became his network, people who provided him not only with information but with perspective. They reminded him that betrayal was not the end, that betrayal, when channeled, could become the foundation of justice. Meanwhile, in Port Charles, the town settled into the illusion that Drew was gone for good. Some were relieved, no longer having to contend with his interference in their affairs. Others were smug, quietly enjoying the irony that a man once so strong was now confined to a chair hundreds of miles away. But among the more astute, unease lingered. They knew Drew's history, knew that he had survived circumstances that would have broken lesser men. They whispered to each other in private that a man like Drew did not simply disappear. His absence felt too much like the pause before a storm, and that thought planted seeds of fear that grew with every rumor of his progress trickling back from Boston. What no one in Port Charles realized was that Drew was no longer content merely to survive. He was planning. Each therapy session was not just recovery, it was training for his return. Each inconsistency in his medical records was not just evidence of betrayal, it was ammunition for the reckoning to come. He envisioned the moment he would will back into Port Charles, or perhaps even walk, shocking those who had written him off as broken. He pictured confronting Portia, exposing her manipulations, tearing down the facade of respectability she had so carefully constructed. And more than that, he imagined the fear in the eyes of those who had laughed at his downfall when they realized he had returned not as a crippled man but as something far more dangerous. A man remade in the crucible of pain and betrayal. Boston became his training ground, a place where pain was alchemized into strength, where despair was weaponized into determination. With Willow as his anchor, with cutting-edge treatments reshaping his body, and with betrayal burning like a furnace in his chest, Drew was no longer the man who had been forced out of Port Charles. He was becoming something new, something sharper, something forged in the dual fires of suffering and rage. And when the time came, Port Charles would not be prepared. They would expect a broken man, pitiful and diminished. What they would face instead was the storm he had become. His return would not merely be the continuation of his story, it would be an eruption, a reckoning that would sweep through the town and lay bare every betrayal, every scheme, every false smile that had thrived in his absence. Drew Kane had been shot, exiled, and humiliated. But now, in the quiet halls of Boston, he was preparing for the moment when he would rise again, and when he did, no one who had sought his downfall would be left untouched.